A porch in the Blue Ridge, September. Long threads hang from the rafters, strings of green beans, curling and browning in the air. Behind the wood stove, more of them. There is no electricity in this house. There will not be for another 20 years. In 1935, roughly 1 in 10 rural American homes had electric service. In the mountain counties, it was fewer, and it stayed that way longer. This is not a story about the distant past. This is somebody's grandmother, feeding 8 people through to April with no refrigerator, no freezer, and no store worth walking to. By the end of this, you will know every system she used, in order, and why each one worked. Drying, cold storage, salt, smoke, fat, fermentation. You will also know which one of these methods still kills Americans every single year. It is not the smokehouse, it is not the crock and the springhouse, it is not the beans on the string. It is the newest thing in the house. Start with the beans, because everything about the mountain kitchen is visible in them. Whole snap beans, threaded onto carpet thread with a sewing needle, tied off and hung, behind the stove, along the porch rafters, up in the attic, or over a slow fire. They stay there for days. They shrink, they darken, they curl into something that looks like a pair of leather trousers that got soaked through and then dried stiff, which is exactly where the name comes from. Leather britches, also called shuck beans, because they were dried in the shuck. Beans shelled out of the pod were shell-outs, or shellies. When they were done, they went into a flour sack or a pillowcase, sometimes with a dried pepper thrown in to keep the insects out, and they kept a year or better. The principle underneath is the simplest in food science. Bacteria, yeasts, and molds cannot grow without water they can reach. Take the moisture out, and nothing rots. No salt, no acid, no heat, no seal. The oldest preservation technology on Earth, and by far the most forgiving. Where it came from is genuinely contested, and it is worth being straight about that. Many food historians attribute it to Cherokee practice. Beans threaded on cord and hung over a low fire, which dries them, smokes them, and keeps the bugs off at once. Others trace it to German settlers out of the Palatinate, who dried beans on strings at home and had a word for it. Cherokee families still make shuck beans today. The honest answer is that the mountains probably received the technique twice, from 2 directions. And it was not only beans. Apples were cut in rings and laid out on cloth, on scaffolds, on hot tin roofs. The dried apples that became the apple stack cake. Pumpkin and squash were cut in rings and hung on poles. Corn was dried on the cob or cut off it. Peppers, herbs, next year's seed. There is one chemical trick here that people forget existed. Sulfuring. Fruit held over burning sulfur before drying keeps its color and resists mold and insects. Nobody does it now. Everybody did it then. The arithmetic is why it mattered. A bushel of beans comes down to something you carry in one hand. Food that keeps without a cellar, without a jar, and without weight. But drying only works on things willing to give up their water. It will not save a potato. It will not save a cabbage, or a turnip, or 100 pounds of apples you intend to eat whole. For those, she needed the second method. And the second method is not something she made. It is something she dug. Cold does not kill anything. That is the part people get wrong. Cold slows things down, bacterial growth, mold, and the vegetable's own ripening enzymes, which will destroy a stored crop just as thoroughly as any microbe. The target was roughly 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, held steady, which is precisely what the refrigerator in your kitchen is doing right now. She was not living without refrigeration. She was doing refrigeration with dirt and water. The springhouse, a small building set over or fed by a spring, with the water channeled through stone basins inside. Milk stood in the running water. Butter, cheese, eggs. Churning was often done in there because the cold set the butter faster. The big stoneware crocks and churn jars went in there too. The root cellar, cut into a hillside, dug beneath the house, or built freestanding and banked with earth. Ventilated with pipe or small openings to control the humidity. Shelves held a few inches off the walls. Potatoes, turnips, apples, cabbages, nuts. And where there was no cellar at all, there was holing up. A pit dug in the ground, produce layered in with straw and dirt, a cone of corn fodder set over the top for a roof. Root crops packed into barrels of damp sand so they would not shrivel. Cabbages pulled whole and buried head down over their own roots. Sweet potatoes wrapped separately and kept warmer and drier, because a sweet potato rots in a cold cellar. The real skill was not digging, it was zoning. Apples kept away from potatoes because apples make everything near them sprout. Squash and pumpkins up in the warm, dry attic, never the cellar. Onions and garlic, dry and airy. Every crop had a temperature and a humidity it wanted, and she knew all of them without owning a thermometer. Now anchor how recent this is. American cities had electric refrigerators through the 1920s. In 1935, around 90% of urban homes had central electricity, against roughly 10% of rural ones. The Tennessee Valley Authority Act came in 1933, the Rural Electrification Administration in May 1935. It was 1942 before about half of American farms had power, and later in the deep mountain counties. Cold buys months, drying buys a year. Neither one of them will hold a hog. For meat, she needed something that did not slow the rot down at all, something that made the food itself hostile. And that is where the mountain kitchen stops being storage and starts being chemistry. 4 ways to make food uninhabitable. Pull the water out osmotically with salt. Coat the surface with antimicrobial compounds using smoke. Seal it under fat, or drop the pH with acid. She used all 4, salt and smoke. The hog was killed in the first hard cold. Hams, shoulders and bacon sides packed in salt, then hung in the smokehouse over a low hardwood fire for days. Say the honest thing. Salt and smoke slow spoilage, they do not sterilize. Cured pork still gets cooked through. Fat, sausage fried down, packed into a crock and sealed under its own rendered lard. The fat sits on the surface and keeps the air off. Mark that method. It is the first one in this entire story that works by excluding oxygen. And that is going to matter more than anything else in this video. It is also a historical practice, not a recommendation. Eggs. 2 techniques almost nobody has seen. Eggs held in waterglass, sodium silicate, or in lime water. Both seal the pores in the shell, and both will hold unwashed eggs for months. And acid, the heart of it. Cabbage shredded, salted, and weighted under its own brine until it becomes kraut. Corn cut off the cob and soured the same way. Pickled corn, a specifically mountain food. Pickled beans, beets, green tomatoes, okra, chow-chow. Stoneware churn jars standing in the cool of the springhouse. What is happening inside that crock is a fermentation. Lactic acid bacteria that were already on the vegetable eat the sugars and excrete lactic acid. The pH falls, and once it drops below about 4.6, that food becomes chemically hostile to nearly every organism that could hurt you. Remember that number. It is the hinge of everything that follows. Now, the thing that ties this chapter together, and the reason the old kitchen was safer than it looks. Every method so far announces its own failure. A badly salted ham stinks. Kraut that never acidified goes soft and slimy. Beans that did not dry properly mold in the sack. Cellared potatoes go to liquid in the corner. You lose the food. You do not lose the person eating it. The food tells you. So that is the inheritance. Dry it, cool it, salt it, smoke it, sour it. 5 methods, none of them requiring anything she could not make herself. All of them were largely gone from mountain kitchens inside 2 generations. And they were not driven out by the refrigerator. They were driven out by something that arrived decades earlier, cost almost nothing, and came into the mountains carried by the federal government. In 1795, the French government offered a prize to anyone who could keep an army fed. A confectioner named Nicolas Appert won it, having worked out that food sealed in glass and boiled would keep. On the 30th of November, 1858, a 26-year-old New Jersey tinsmith named John Landis Mason patented a threaded screwneck jar with a matching cap. United States patent 22,186. Before Mason, home canning meant corks and sealing wax, and it leaked and it failed. Mason's jar did not. His patent expired in 1879. His competitors took the design, and Mason himself died poor in a New York tenement in 1902. The Ball brothers started making jars in 1885 and moved to Muncie, Indiana. Kerr entered the trade in 1903. Glass became cheap, reusable, and universal. But cheap glass is not what put jars into a mountain hollow. Here is the mechanism most people never hear. The Smith-Lever Act of 1914 created the Cooperative Extension Service, and with it, the Home Demonstration Agent. Trained women sent from the land-grant universities into rural counties to teach modern household technique. Then the First World War and the National War Garden Commission made preserving your own produce a patriotic act. The Second World War did it again. Home canning peaked in 1943 at more than 4 billion jars. And be fair to the jar, because this is not a villain. Canning is faster than drying. It needs no cellar, no spring, no smokehouse, no crock, and no cooperation from the weather. The food comes out tasting close to fresh, and it is visible. A wall of full jars states a family's security in a way that a pillowcase of dried beans simply cannot. Every household that could get jars got jars. The strings came off the porches. The crocks went to the barn. Within 2 generations, the drying and souring and cellaring knowledge had thinned to a handful of families and a few dishes kept for Christmas. But look closely at what the jar actually does. It is the first method in this entire story that preserves food by sealing the air out of a container. Not fat floating on a surface, a true, permanent, airtight seal held at room temperature on a shelf in the dark. In 1917, the United States Department of Agriculture issued a warning about home canning that concerned one specific category of food. Green beans were on the list. Clostridium botulinum lives in soil. It is on the outside of essentially every vegetable pulled out of a garden, and in open air it does absolutely nothing. because it cannot grow where there is oxygen. It survives instead as a spore, and that spore will sit in boiling water indefinitely and come out unharmed. To wake up and produce toxin, it needs 4 things at once: no oxygen, low acid, a pH above 4.6, moisture, and room temperature. A sealed jar of green beans on a pantry shelf is all 4 conditions simultaneously. Nothing in the pre-jar kitchen ever supplied all 4 together. That is the argument of this entire video in a single sentence. And here is why boiling the jars is not enough. The toxin itself is destroyed by heat. The spores are not. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and the spores survive it. Killing them takes around 240 degrees. A temperature water cannot reach at normal atmospheric pressure. You can only get there under pressure, which is why pressure canning is the only recommended method for low-acid foods, and why a water bath canner is fine for pickles, kraut, jam, and most fruit, all of them acidic, and is not fine for beans, corn, carrots, beets, asparagus, or meat. Now the part that matters most. Every other method in this video announces its own failure. This one does not. Botulinum toxin in a properly sealed jar produces no smell, no taste, no bubbling, no cloudiness, no swelling. The jar looks right. The food looks right. There is nothing to notice. The generation that carried 200 years of trust, your senses into the jar era, carried in the exact instinct that the jar era punishes. This is not a historical footnote. The Centers for Disease Control states plainly that home-canned vegetables are the most common cause of foodborne botulism outbreaks in the United States. Of 116 outbreaks reported between 1999 and 2008, among the 48 caused by home-prepared foods, 38%, 18 outbreaks, came from home-canned vegetables. The vehicles repeat: green beans, asparagus, carrots, corn. An Ohio grandfather and 3 of his grandchildren, 2008. 3 people in Spokane, 2009, from beans out of a backyard garden. A Virginia couple who died in 2007. And in its guidance on home canning, the CDC tells Americans to use only recipes that follow the federal guide, and specifically not to use other recipes, even ones that came from a trusted friend or a family member. A federal agency in writing, telling you not to trust your grandmother's canning recipe. Let that land properly, because the easy conclusion is the wrong one. She was not wrong. Her methods were sound, and her senses were reliable. For every single technique she inherited. What failed was the handover. A technology arrived that broke the one rule those senses were built on. The warning went out in 1917 to a population that largely could not hear it. And the correction never traveled down the family line the way the recipe did. The danger was never old knowledge. It was old confidence, applied to a new machine. Everything in the first 3 chapters of this video still works. None of it needs equipment. None of it can poison you invisibly. The strings of beans on that porch were not a poorer version of the jar on the shelf. They were a method that could not fail in silence. So if you take one thing out of 20 minutes, pressure can your beans, or hang them.